French Romantic writers first developed the term to describe their own relationship to historical time, the notion of a transitional period. At first, the term strictly related to the evolving periodic conception of history, one that required breaks, spaces, or zones of indeterminacy to bracket off periods imagined as organic wholes. These transitions, necessary devices in the new grammar of history, also began to attract interest on their own, conceived either as chaotic but creative times of transformation, or, more often, slack periods of decadence that possessed no proper style but exhibited hybrid traits. To say we live in unprecedented times is beyond cliché. I'm sure we can all agree that proclamations about the grand significance of the present moment are as meaningless as they are hubristic. As we have come to see history in a periodic way, i.e. the Victorian era or the Industrial Revolution, we need a concept of what makes up a connective tissue between such periods. On the other hand, this has come to be seen as a somewhat outdated view of history, and it is both common and perhaps inevitable that people will tend to view themselves on the precipice, similar to how we tend to see ourselves as living in the end times. I do think this is a useful concept because certain times in history seem to both create and illuminate societal changes on a massive scale. I think the First World War is a great example of this phenomenon. It seems as if the pace of change was rapidly accelerated, and I will argue that this is because times of crisis tend to point out the tensions inherent in these transitionary periods as the old world becomes new. This picture is going to be our roadmap to the period of transition in World War I. To begin with, let's start with the most well-known change that occurred during the war. This person is obviously on a horse. Indeed, World War I saw some of the largest and last great cavalry charges in military history. At the start of the war, the French still used cuirassiers that basically looked exactly like those Napoleon had used in his great bloodletting of Europe. Obviously, these cavalry units would no longer be effective in the face of modern killing power. The lack of what's called an exploding arm to replace cavalry contributed a great deal to the stagnation of the front and defensive advantage that would come to mark the war. By the end of the war, the Entente were launching combined arms offensive much like that would be seen in the Second World War, supporting infantry assaults with tanks, armed personnel carriers, and planes flying what we would call today ground support missions, fighting in great wars of maneuver. These tactics are a sort of proto-blitzkrieg, the well-known lightning war tactics used by the Wehrmacht and SS in the Second World War. However, it would be deceptive to say that mechanization was instant or even complete by the Second World War. The Wehrmacht invaded the USSR with some 625,000 horses, but the First World War was certainly the beginning and the end of the war horse. Today, some form of these tactics, employing a coordinated assault of artillery, infantry, and mechanized forces and aircraft, are used by every army in the world in various forms of combined arms doctrines. One can find another example of the changes in tactics that occurred during the war in the development of what would be called stormtrooper divisions, where command is devolved into smaller units that acted autonomously, pursuing offensive objectives. Created by handpicking the best soldiers and equipment from infantry divisions across the German army, the stormtroopers were veteran soldiers who were armed to the teeth and extremely effective. The purpose of these units was to use shock tactics to precisely attack the enemy and sow confusion and fear in their lines, through what would come to be known as infiltration tactics. In 1918, these divisions were most famously used in the Kaiserschlacht, or Emperor's Battle. Entente lines were overrun by stormtroopers on the morning of March 21st after these stormtroopers emerged from the morning fog, advancing unnoticed until they were no more than a few yards from the trench. They were subsequently supported by precision artillery strikes and followed by normal infantry divisions, nearly ending the war right then and there, were it not for a valiant British and French defense of the Amiens supply junction. These units would pioneer what would come to be called fire and move tactics, which again are used by every army in the world today. Moving on, and going back to our picture for orientation, the next thing I'll draw your attention to is the helmet the soldier is wearing. This is the famous Stahlhelm design, and this is basically the same thing the Germans wear into the Second World War. One may notice, if they have ever seen any film or photography of the First World War, that this is not the Pickelhaube or Pickelhelm that is also so famously associated with the German army, the one with the pointy bit. The name literally means pointed bonnet. At first, they were all made of leather, the flaws of which I'd hope the audience already understands. This was standard issue helmet of the German army until 1914, but by 1916, production was eventually shifted away from the Pickelhelm. While some new designs of the Pickelhelm were offered, it was eventually replaced by the Stahlhelm or steel helmet. This not only was easier to produce, but reduced infantry head wounds by up to 70%. On the note of updated kit, and coming back to our cavalry one once more, the gas mask also stands out a lot. This was another dramatic change during the war, the general nastiness of weapons used on all sides. Among the most infamous of these weapons associated with the First World War was gas, chemical warfare. Though other benign weapon systems like improved artillery spotting and barbed wire had a much greater impact on the conflict as a whole, gas presented the average soldier with a new terror, the psychological impact of which cannot be underestimated. The fields of Passchendaele and Verdun scarred the collective unconscious of a whole generation. This went much beyond the gas, mud, and blood of the front, as new technologies also presented the horror of bombing cities, whether by long-range artillery, airplane, or dirigible. Total war had re-emerged, and now the struggles of great nations were not just fought in the hermetically sealed space of the front, but also in the factories, fields, and shops, the home front, so to speak. Even before Oppenheimer and Become Death, people like Woodrow Wilson recognized that the cost of war between industrialized nations was horrific in a new way. As humanity became more efficient at making cars, planes, and ships, thusly we became more efficient at inflicting staggering casualties in the battlefield, and indeed on the cities of nations who happened to be at war. By the time shells started dropping on Paris, war had lost much of its romanticism, and after the Second World War, the stakes had changed completely. No longer was the threat the destruction of a nation or the destruction of a peoples, but the destruction of all nation and all peoples. Zooming back out one more time, we will try to look at the gestalt of this picture, or whatever. The crazy steampunk Victorian industrial times of the conflict illuminated the faults between a dead world and the new world that was growing from its corpse. Men fought in tanks, yet they still fought on horseback. They flew in planes and charged with bayonets. The new procedures of warfare were developed at a staggering cost in human life, and completely redrew the map of Europe. We've spent a lot of time discussing military changes that were brought in by the war, because these changes are the easiest to explain, and because they were often directly caused by the war. Much social and political change also occurred during the war, obviously. Political structures rose and fell, perhaps most dramatically in Russia, the rise of communism itself probably being the most enduring theme of the whole war. A specter was haunting Europe, you see, and the Kaiser, as well as the other old powers, remembered well the uprising of 1848. If one puts this in context with the French Revolution, the seeds that would sow the rise of fascism, or the coming struggle between the communist East and capitalist West, it seems impossible to understate the degree to which the war changed the structures of the world. I'm starting to move quickly because we really could go on forever. We haven't even touched on submarines and the changes in naval warfare, the relationship between civilian governments and the military, colonialism and decolonization, the creation of the League of Nations, and the beginning of international government. My point is, one ought to notice is how the First World War, in very particular ways, can demonstrate and seem to accelerate the changes in human societies that occurred at the turn of the 20th century. How the tank showed the development of the internal combustion engine and the growing importance of gasoline, or how chemical weapons demonstrated the increasingly deadly nature of human weaponry. This conflict has revealed and exacerbated the changes in society at every level in every corner of the world, and accelerated this kind of industrial modernity that would come to define the middle 20th century. I think that the coronavirus might be doing the same thing to our world now. I don't have a picture to use as a roadmap, alas. It has been much remarked that this crisis really seems to just be the exacerbation of all the other slow-burn crises that have begun to rot the girding of modern societies. From the inequality in wealth to the racial and geographic disparities in aid, many of the cleavages that divide modern society have not only become apparent, but have begun to drift wider. Just to start with, the strain that has been placed on modern healthcare systems has pushed many countries to the brink of their capacity, especially in countries like the United States that don't have existing socialized care networks. Even in countries that do have more robust national health systems, many have shown how dramatically unprepared they were for a crisis of this magnitude. The worldwide shortage of ventilators and protective equipment stand as the most obvious example of this. Like many other things, these systems were strung along in times of peace, and now peacetime is over. Similar to how we can see the rise of trends evolving in World War I, we can see the result of many long-term trends in our society today. The crumbling welfare states of liberal democracy in an almost perfect storm have been hollowed out after years of austerity following the 2008 financial crisis. Governments are petrified of raising taxes on individuals or corporations, so the only option is to cut public spending. Social safety nets were ruthlessly stripped to the marrow. As people struggled to afford housing, the price of commodities in the stock market were being kept stable by generous government bailouts. Yet our leaders insisted that more austerity was needed. Now, as an economic crisis that rivals the Great Depression unfolds, governments are unable to do anything other than demand that their citizens sacrifice themselves on the altar of economic stability and pick clean the skeleton of the public sphere. Some states have been able to cope better because they could plan their economy in flexible ways, but the world's old and stiff power structures simply cannot keep up with this rapidly accelerating crisis. Burke's storied aristocracy has once again proven themselves to be shameless bandits who serve no other purpose than to hoard wealth and power for the sake of their own ego, and relentlessly assail anything that might be called the common good. Our eyes should be set on the kleptocrats that denigrate our most hallowed institutions today. And what a show they'll put on, idly proclaiming and prognosticating, lulled into inaction by a sense of progress as shallow and self-assured as they are themselves. It's hard to say what this crisis will reveal while it is going on, but the plethora of inequalities, inefficiencies, and injustice that color the world today, the only thing that would truly be surprising is that everything will remain the same 5 years down the road. Thanks for watching.